You're standing in the echoing halls of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Gold mosaics glimmer in the torchlight, priests chant and incense coils into the air. It looks holy, sacred, untouchable. But behind the curtains of silk and the walls of marble, there exists a darker chamber, where flesh was traded for power, where women were trained not as wives but as tools, and where a single empress would rise from degradation to dominion. She began as nothing more than a spectacle in the shadows, paraded for the desires of men, and yet she became one of the most powerful women the Byzantine throne had ever seen. But the question is, at what cost? Before we uncover the truth about these horrifying practices and the dangerous empress they created, make sure you subscribe, because the history you're about to hear is the kind no classroom will ever dare to teach. The Byzantine Empire prided itself on glory. In the streets of Constantinople, marble columns gleamed beneath the Mediterranean sun, mosaics shimmered like jewels, and the chants of priests promised eternal salvation. To the outside world, it was the holy empire of Christianity, a fortress of morality standing against the chaos of barbarian kingdoms. But if you stepped away from the processions of saints and the solemn weight of church bells, another Constantinople revealed itself. Behind the painted walls, in the smoky taverns and candlelit theatres, there thrived a world of shadows. It was a world where faith met flesh, and holiness was nothing more than a mask for indulgence. Here, the circus was not just entertainment, it was politics, desire, and control. The hippodrome, capable of holding more than 100,000 voices, shook with chants not only for chariot races but for factional power struggles that could topple emperors. And tied to this spectacle were the women of the stage, actresses, dancers, courtesans, their bodies displayed as symbols of both temptation and humiliation. The contradiction was staggering. By day, the church thundered against sin, condemning lust as the poison of the soul. But by night, the most powerful men in Byzantium filled the front rows of performances, watching women dance in thin veils, laughing as actresses enacted scenes of seduction. Morality was a sermon for the masses, but behind closed doors, indulgence was the real law of the empire. This was no accident. Sexual spectacle was a tool of governance, a pressure valve for a restless population, a gift to soldiers, a distraction from rebellion. It was not just entertainment, it was a system, and within this system, countless girls were consumed, their lives traded for the fleeting pleasure of the crowd. One of those girls would be Theodora, but before she could rise to power, she first had to be broken by this theatre of shadows. To be born poor in Byzantium was to live on the edge of survival, but to be born a girl of the lower classes was to live with almost no choice at all. Families desperate for bread often sold their daughters into the theatres, a word that in Constantinople was almost synonymous with the brothel. The training began young. Girls were taught to dance, to sing, to move their bodies in ways that stirred desire. Costumes were not mere costumes, but deliberate humiliations. Silks cut too short, masks that exposed more than they hid, gestures designed not for art, but for arousal. For the audience, it was spectacle. For the girl, it was captivity. The empire's obsession with spectacle went far beyond the stage. Certain plays openly mocked morality, actors mimicking priests in drunken stupors, actresses forced into degrading roles where comedy was little more than public violation, and when the performances ended, the curtain never truly closed. Many of the women were expected to entertain patrons afterward, sold for the night to noblemen or officers. These women were bound by unspoken rules. They could never look too proud, never reject advances, never hope for respect. Their names were whispered in alleyways, but never honoured in history. They were living paradoxes, visible to all of Constantinople, yet condemned as outcasts. And yet, within this cruelty, something else brewed. The system, designed to strip women of power, sometimes taught them survival instead. A woman who learned how to charm, how to manipulate attention, how to turn ridicule into fascination. Such a woman could rise higher than anyone expected. Most girls were broken by the system. A few learned how to use it, and one, Theodora would transform it into her weapon. Theodora was not born in a palace of marble, but in a shabby house near the roar of the hippodrome. Her father was a bearkeeper, a man whose livelihood depended on providing beasts for the bloody spectacles of the circus. When he died, Theodora's mother was left with 3 daughters and no protection. In Byzantium, that meant only one thing: survival through desperation. Her mother brought the girls to the hippodrome, begging one of the circus factions to employ them. Theodora, still only a child, was pushed into the world of performance. At first, she was just another girl among many, painted, costumed, and thrown before jeering crowds. But she quickly learned that survival required more than compliance. It required cleverness. Audiences laughed at her. Men mocked her. She was forced into acts that blurred the line between comedy and cruelty, scenes designed to humiliate rather than entertain. But she memorized faces. She studied the way powerful men leaned forward when she spoke boldly instead of meekly. She learned how to turn shame into spectacle, how to seize control of a gaze meant to degrade her. Theodora's world was brutal, but it was also instructive. Every jeer taught her resilience. Every role forced upon her gave her insight into power. She was becoming dangerous. Though no one yet realized it, the Empire saw her as disposable, just another body in the endless cycle of pleasure and spectacle. But beneath the paint, beneath the silks, beneath the cruelty, Theodora was watching, and she was waiting. Soon, this girl from the shadows would step onto a stage much larger than the hippodrome, and Constantinople itself would never forget her name. Theodora's youth was forged in humiliation. She was a spectacle for crowds, a plaything for the wealthy, a reminder that in Byzantium a poor woman's body was never her own. But from this nightmare, she began to shape her armor. She learned how to wear shame like silk. If the men in the audience mocked her, she mocked them back, turning their laughter into uneasy admiration. If she was forced to play the fool on stage, she did so with a spark of wit that made her unforgettable. In a society that expected her silence, she wielded words like daggers, sharp, quick, and always unexpected. But survival was not only wit. Theodora studied the invisible rules of the empire: when to bow her head, when to smile, when to pretend submission so that arrogance might blind her captors. She discovered the paradox of power, that sometimes appearing powerless was the greatest weapon, and then there was seduction. In a world where men saw her only as flesh, she chose to turn their desire against them. She could charm, flatter, and disarm, but unlike other courtesans who became trapped by their patrons, Theodora never gave herself completely. She played the game of intimacy like chess, never losing sight of the next move. Still, survival came at a price. Every compromise cut away at her innocence. Every night she performed for the lust of strangers left her with scars deeper than the eye could see. But within her pain, a transformation was taking place. Theodora was no longer a girl being used by the system. She was becoming a woman who understood it, and who could one day break it. Constantinople was a city of chance encounters. One evening, Theodora crossed paths with a man who would alter the course of her life: Justinian, the ambitious nephew of the emperor. Justinian was not yet the all-powerful ruler history remembers. He was a man with vision, eager to climb, and he saw in Theodora something no one else had noticed. Not just beauty, but brilliance. Not just allure, but fire. Their meeting was whispered about for years. Some said it was love at first sight, that Justinian, captivated, ignored the sneers of courtiers who mocked him for choosing a courtesan. Others argued it was strategy, a union of two minds who recognized in each other a shared hunger for survival. Theodora did not play the role of the meek mistress. She spoke boldly, challenged Justinian, even advised him, and instead of recoiling, he admired her. She gave him something no sycophant could: truth wrapped in daring. For a man destined to rule, such honesty was priceless, but society was less forgiving. The law barred senators and heirs from marrying actresses or courtesans, branding such women unworthy of nobility. For Theodora, it seemed another wall had been built to keep her in the shadows, yet Justinian refused to bend. Obsessed with her, he lobbied his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law itself. And astonishingly, it was done. A decree swept aside centuries of prejudice, lifting the barrier between them. In that moment, Theodora's rise began in earnest. What had once been a scandal was now an official union. The courtesan, once jeered by drunken crowds, was now the chosen consort of the empire's future ruler. Was it love? Was it ambition? Perhaps it was both. But either way, it was power, and Theodora knew exactly what to do with it. In 527, the great Hagia Sophia echoed with chants as Justinian ascended the throne. But he was not alone. At his side, draped in imperial robes of purple, stood Theodora. The transformation was staggering. The woman once ridiculed in the theatres now wore the crown of Byzantium. The crowd, the same voices that had once laughed at her humiliation, now bowed before her. What they saw as impossible, she had made inevitable. Her coronation was more than ceremony. It was defiance. She was no longer the object of desire, no longer the puppet of men in power. She was the Empress of the Romans, equal to her husband in title, and in time greater than him in will. Theodora stood beneath the mosaics, her gaze steady, her voice unshaken. She had endured the cruelty of a patriarchal system, survived the mockery of the hippodrome, and overcome laws written to erase her existence. Every scar she carried now gleamed like hidden armour beneath the jewels. The whispers never ceased. Aristocrats sneered behind closed doors. Priests muttered about sin. But Theodora had already mastered the art of turning scorn into strength. For every insult hurled against her, she answered with action. She would not only reign, she would rule. In that moment, the empire was forced to reckon with a truth it could never have imagined. The courtesan had become the empress, and this was only the beginning. Because Theodora, forged in humiliation, would wield her past like a weapon. The stage had taught her how to captivate. The streets had taught her how to survive, and now the throne would teach her how to command. The girl from the Theatre of Shadows was gone. In her place stood an empress. Dangerous, relentless, unforgettable. Theodora did not sit silently beside Justinian, as most empresses before her had done. From the moment she wore the crown, she seized her place not as ornament, but as force. The girl who once had no rights became the woman who rewrote them. She passed laws that forbade trafficking of young girls, outlawed forcing actresses into prostitution, and expanded property rights for women. What she had suffered, she sought to change, though not out of idealism alone, but out of ruthless memory. Each law was both justice and vengeance, a declaration that no girl would endure what she once endured without at least the chance of escape. But reform was only one side of her power. Theodora was also a master manipulator of Byzantine politics. Courtiers who dismissed her as a former courtesan soon found themselves cornered by her intelligence. She advised Justinian not only in matters of domestic law, but in the great questions of empire, diplomacy, military campaigns, even religious disputes. Her counsel was sharp, often harsher than Justinian's own, and he listened. The clergy despised her influence. Aristocrats whispered of her past, calling her unworthy of the throne. But Theodora had grown up in the jeers of the hippodrome. Their scorn was powerless against her iron will. She knew how to hold power in a world that had denied her humanity. She rewarded loyalty with generosity, and she punished betrayal with merciless efficiency. Friends became allies, enemies became corpses or exiles. In the golden halls of Constantinople, beneath mosaics that glowed with images of saints, Theodora moved like a shadow queen, half holy icon, half ruthless survivor. Theodora did not sit silently beside Justinian, as most empresses before her had done. From the moment she wore the crown, she seized her place not as ornament, but as force. The girl who once had no rights became the woman who rewrote them. She passed laws that forbade trafficking of young girls, outlawed forcing actresses into prostitution, and expanded property rights for women. What she had suffered, She sought change, though not out of idealism alone, but out of ruthless memory. Each law was both justice and vengeance, a declaration that no girl would endure what she once endured without at least the chance of escape. But reform was only one side of her power. Theodora was also a master manipulator of Byzantine politics. Courtiers who dismissed her as a former courtesan soon found themselves cornered by her intelligence. She advised Justinian not only in matters of domestic law, but in the great questions of empire, diplomacy, military campaigns, even religious disputes. Her counsel was sharp, often harsher than Justinian's own, and he listened. The clergy despised her influence. Aristocrats whispered of her past, calling her unworthy of the throne. But Theodora had grown up in the jeers of the hippodrome. Their scorn was powerless against her iron will. She knew how to hold power in a world that had denied her humanity. She rewarded loyalty with generosity, and she punished betrayal with merciless efficiency. Friends became allies, enemies became corpses or exiles. In the golden halls of Constantinople, beneath mosaics that glowed with images of saints, Theodora moved like a shadow queen, half holy icon, half ruthless survivor. In 532, the empire itself trembled. The factions of the hippodrome, the blues and the greens, erupted into open revolt, furious over Justinian's taxes and corruption. What began as a protest became the Nika riots, a wave of fury that engulfed Constantinople. For 5 days the city burned. The palace shook with the roar of the crowd. Senators plotted to replace Justinian with a rival, and in the imperial chambers the emperor faltered. Advisors urged retreat, a flight across the Bosphorus, leaving the throne behind to save his life. Justinian hesitated, but Theodora did not. Standing before generals and senators, she silenced the room with a voice as unyielding as stone. Her words have echoed through history. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. Purple makes the noblest winding sheet. She declared she would rather die an empress than live in disgrace. She reminded them that to flee was to abandon everything, to live as exiles when the empire was theirs to command. Fear, she told them, was the enemy, and she would not bow to it. Her speech transformed the moment. Shamed and emboldened, Justinian rallied his forces. Troops were unleashed upon the rioters, and in the hippodrome where Theodora once danced, thousands were slaughtered. A sea of bodies silenced beneath imperial steel. The city was left in ashes, but the throne was secure, and it was Theodora, not Justinian, who had made it so. Her defiance revealed what few could deny. This empress was no puppet. She was a ruler in her own right, one whose will could decide the fate of an empire. Theodora's reign was a paradox. She championed women, yet ruled with ruthless cruelty. She protected the vulnerable, yet ordered the massacre of thousands. She was both liberator and tyrant, and perhaps it was impossible to be one without the other in the brutal world of Byzantium. Her past never left her. To the priests she was forever tainted by sin. To the nobles she was forever the courtesan who dared to wear a crown. But to the poor, to the forgotten, she was something else entirely. Proof that power could rise from the gutter, that a girl mocked in the theatres could command emperors. The irony is cruel. The horrifying sexual practices of Byzantium, designed to degrade women and strip them of identity, had instead forged one of history's most dangerous empresses. The very system meant to break her became the crucible that made her unbreakable. Theodora died in 548, still young, likely from cancer. She left behind no direct heirs, but her shadow lingered over the empire. Laws she passed continued to shape lives. Her mosaic in Ravenna, Italy, robed in imperial purple, staring with unyielding eyes, remains one of the most haunting images of Byzantine art. History asks us, who was Theodora? A saint of reform, a cunning survivor, or simply another ruler, hardened by cruelty until she became the cruelty herself? Perhaps she was all of these at once, and so her legacy endures, a woman born in the shadows, shaped by degradation, yet crowned in glory. A woman who terrified priests, silenced senators, and proved that power, once tasted, could never again be taken from her. The courtesan had become the empress, and the empire would never be the same. The story began in the shadows of Constantinople, where the flicker of torchlight revealed a girl paraded for the pleasure of others, a girl mocked, humiliated, and discarded. That same girl rose to stand beneath golden mosaics as the Empress of Byzantium, her voice shaking emperors and silencing rebellions. The irony is inescapable. The very system built to degrade women created one of the most powerful rulers in history. What was meant to break Theodora instead became the fire that forged her, and yet her story forces us to ask a haunting question. Was Theodora a champion of justice, or simply another tyrant moulded by cruelty? Did she free women, or did she prove that survival in a brutal world requires becoming brutal yourself? Her mosaic still gazes down at us, eyes unblinking, lips closed in a silence that offers no easy answers. But perhaps that is her final lesson. History is not simple. Heroes are born from pain, villains are shaped by survival, and sometimes the most dangerous rulers are the ones who were once denied their humanity. So, I leave you with this. If Theodora's rise from the shadows teaches us anything, it is that even the most broken beginnings can create legacies strong enough to terrify empires. What do you think? Was Theodora a liberator or a tyrant wearing the mask of justice? If you found yourself drawn into her story, make sure to subscribe for more hidden histories. Tales too dark, too complex, and too human to ever appear in your school books. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation alive. Because history is not just about the past. It's about the truths we're still afraid to face.